Students, today we are going to have a background information on the experimental research in education. In any research, we collect data from person or thing. Person we also call participants, and the participants possesses a variety of characteristics. If characteristics of a group of participants differ from group members of the group, it is called variable. Variables, by definition, by Miller and Nichols in 1976, defines that variables are properties, that the characteristics of participants or people, okay, or things which vary, which differ in quality or magnitude from person to person or object to object. And that variable, those characteristics that researcher is interested to study is called variables. It may be demographic characteristics like socioeconomic status, like gender, which varies. And if you're interested to study, that is also called variables. Next is personality characteristics, for example, which vary from person to person in the quality and magnitude also. So those can also be called variables. Variables are usually traditionally classified as quantitative variables and qualitative variables. Quantitative variables are the ones that exist along a continuum. That means there is a continuity which runs from either high to low or low to high. There is a continuity in the scores, in the numbers of the variables, in quantitative variables. So ordinal, interval, ratio variables are all quantitative variables. In other words, quantitative variables is also called a continuous variable because they have a variety or a continuum of characteristics. For example, scores of a test. Scores of a test in a classroom in any subject may vary from high to low or low to high, and these kind of numbers can be studied as a quantitative variables. Another is qualitative variables. These variables do not express the differences in amount, but they express differences only in the form of differences, and it's grouped into different categories. That's why it is also called categorical variables, because they classify by categories. Example, gender. Male and female cannot be categorized in amount, but it can be categorized into different categories. Religion and other variables which can exist in categories. Subjects, for example. In experimental research, we have two main variables, that is independent variable and dependent variable. Here we're going to talk about the independent variable. Is also called experimental variable or manipulated variables. Is also called a treatment variable or the grouping variables. These variables are those variables which are measured, which are manipulated or experimented, manipulated or selected by the experimenter to find its relationship to an observed phenomena. An observed phenomena in experimental research is the dependent variable. So that variable which is selected by the experimenter to conduct experiment, which is manipulated, which is used as a treatment, which is also used to group, is called independent variable. And the other variable to see the impact of the treatment variable, the other variable is also called a dependent variable. It is also called outcome variable. That variable which is observed and measured to find the effect of the independent variable, because independent variable we manipulate, used as a treatment. However, in any school situation in education, we cannot have only independent and dependent variable like in physical sciences. We're bound to have different variables because we deal with human beings. So moderator variable are those variable which is measured, which is also manipulated or selected by experimenter to discover whether it modifies the relationship of the independent variable to an observed phenomena or the dependent variable, whether it affects any other variable which affects the relationship between the independent and dependent variable, and the researcher is interested to study, is called moderator variable. And there is extraneous variable are those variables which cannot be controlled. but we can make it constant, this variable, which may or may not influence the result of the experimental research. So experiment is any research or experiment which is conducted in a controlled condition. Now, experimental research in education cannot be conducted in a lab because we deal with the human being. However, to a large extent, we can make a very strictly controlled situation to establish the cause and effect relationship between the dependent and independent variable is called an experiment in educational research. The experimental research helps to establish cause and effect relationship among the different variables under a controlled condition in a controlled classroom. Here there is example. For example, we're using technology to see the effect of the technology on achievement of the students. So technology can be manipulated. Technology are selected by the experiment. Technology are can be used as a treatment. So this is an independent variable, and see the impact, outcome. Outcome is the achievement. So achievement of the student is the outcome variable or the dependent variable. However, it is not possible to have in a classroom for 15 days when you experiment, for example, conduct experiment, it is not possible that only technology may affect the achievement. It may be IQ of the students. It may be the interest. It may be the study habits. It may be socioeconomic status, which may affect the relationship between the independent and dependent variable. And these variables are called intervening variables. It is very important in experimental research to control these intervening variables. Otherwise, the result will not be valid. And when we conduct the experiment, for example, from the pre-test to the post-test, if the shift from the pre-test to the later part, that's post-test, is because of the treatment, and this difference in the score from pre-test to post-test is called a treatment variance. And that's very good when we conduct experiment. However, as an experimenter, we have to be very careful of intervening variables. If that shift or difference is because of the intervening variables, like IQ, like socioeconomic status, like the habits, like the interests of the students, but we make a mistake by saying that it is because of the treatment, then this error is called error variance. In any experimental research, we have to minimize the error variance and maximize the treatment variance, and so that we can increase the validity of experimental research design. As per Campbell and Stanley in 1963, they identified different sources of error which affects the experimental research design, which affects the internal validity of experimental research design. Some of them I have listed it out here. They are history, maturation, pre-testing, measuring instrument, differential selection of subjects, experimental mortality. Now here the history is not the past events. Here the history are those probably the past events and also the simultaneous program which goes on in the institution, which may affect the experiment. Taking the same example, if we want to use the technology to see the impact on the achievement of the students, and the students are attending computer classes in the school, which is very good. So the children may learn not only because of the experiment, it may be because of the computer class. So we as an experimenter, we have to be very aware what are the intervening variables which may affect the result of experiment. It may be because of the maturation. It may be the experiment is the standard of experiment is so low and the children are already biologically matured. They're aware of it. They already have a knowledge. Then the outcome or the achievement of the learner is not because of the experiment. It could be because of the biological maturation of the learner. So it may also affect the internal validity. Next is pre-testing. If the duration of pre-test and the post-test is very short, and the children remember, the students, learners remember the questions of the pre-test and do well in the post-test, and the achievement is high in the post-test, is not because of the treatment, it is because duration is very low and they remember the questions set in the pre-test. Another source of error is measuring instrument. The questions to test the achievement is very easy, or the difficulty value is very low. All the students could achieve very well, very high through the test, or the measuring instrument or the test questions is very low. The difficulty value is very low. It may affect the internal validity of experimental research. Or differential selection of the subject. If the students are selected in a biased way. For example, for an experiment, if you select only the intelligent student of the classroom, the bright ones of the classroom, naturally they will do well in the experiment. It is not because of the treatment or the experiment, it is because they have already, their IQs are high. So we have to, when we select the students, randomized selection of such students in the group, in experimental group, is very important. The last one is experimental mortality. The students, if they are not able to continue in the experiment and they drop out of the experiment before the final post-test, that may also affect the internal validity of the experiment. Now, not only the outcome of the experimental research, how we generalize is also very important. Now, external validity is concerned with generalizability of the experiment. Bracht and Glass in 1968 mentioned that when we generalize, we have to be very careful of population validity and ecological validity. Otherwise, it will affect the external validity of experimental research. So population validity is that when we conduct experiment, we cannot conduct experiment with the learners of large 150 groups, large groups. We usually conduct in a smaller group of 15 to 20 students or the learners. Now, when these learners, outcome of the small groups are generalized, we have to be very careful. It is very risky to generalize from accessible population to a target population. It is very important to have a thorough knowledge, otherwise the validity of research will be affected. And we have to be careful of who are the accessible population and to what extent we can generalize to a larger population. Next is ecological validity, that is, in what set of conditions we have conducted experiment. For example, we conduct experiment in a school which has all the facilities, and the experiment is conducted very well. And we cannot generalize in a school where there are no facilities at all. So if we have to be careful when we generalize from one environmental set to another environmental set, otherwise it will affect the external validity of our experimental research. So in this way, we have to be careful of the sources of error so that we can make a very valid experimental research and establish the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable.